We are the University of Bedfordshire, where groundbreakers take risks, where future leaders make their mark, where high flyers soar. Get the support and opportunities to achieve more, become more, defy expectations. Find out how a degree at Bedfordshire can change your life. Book now for our open day on November 21st at beds.ac.uk/defy.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Paranormal Concept Show, exclusive to the Paranormal UK radio network. I'm your host Paul Rook, and as always we are joined by the stupendous Kerry Greenaway and Richard Clements. Hello guys.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Yeah, busy.
I bet. busy in lockdown, yeah?
Busy in lockdown.
Oh, that woman, Paul, she's always got something to do.
At UK Export Finance, we ensure that no viable UK export fails by providing government-backed finance and insurance. So if you want to expand into new markets, we can help you win contracts with attractive finance terms. If you've got an overseas order, we can help you fulfill it with a working capital loan. And if you're entering a challenging market, we can ensure that you get paid with the right insurance. We've helped hundreds of companies to win contracts, fulfill orders and get paid.
To get the exporter's edge, search UK Export Finance.
Always got something to do.
And she's always late with the blogs. Have you noticed that, Richard?
Yeah, well, I can't talk, I suppose, but yeah.
All I'm saying is at least you got one this time without nagging me.
No, that's true, absolutely. I need another one by tomorrow, do you know that?
I was thinking that, and probably owe you about 4, don't I?
Oh dear.
Oh dear.
What topic have we decided to go with tonight?
Well, we were talking about last week bonfire night, weren't we? And we came up with James I, and he wrote Demonology, which started off the witch trials, which led us down to a discussion point regarding witches and the history and the beginnings of it all and stuff like this. So we couldn't talk about this kind of topic without bringing our producer, our lovely producer, Mr. Andy Mercer, back into the room, because if anyone knows anything about this sort of topic, it's him, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope so, yeah.
So I think we should introduce Andy now.
Let's hope he's here. Andy?
Yeah, I'm here. Yes,
Oh,
I'm
good.
here.
Come out
very
from
quiet.
the chairs, come on.
Yeah, the fireworks have stopped. You can come out behind the cupboard now.
We've had 3 days of them around here, bloody fireworks. Kids are running around setting them off, which is not good.
Yeah, we've got the same going on down here. It's driving my poor dog crazy.
I can imagine.
Bless him. So, Andy, we're talking all about witches and stuff like that, and it's a very complicated kind of history, isn't it? But let's go to the early stages of witchcraft, which basically the first sort of knowledge we've got of this is from grimoires, isn't it?
Well, sort of. I mean, you can talk about sort of shamanistic practices that go back thousands of years into prehistory, which you could say shamans or witchcraft have a certain kind of similarity in the terms of working with sort of energies around and that sort of thing. So, I mean, you can't really have a history or origins of witchcraft because it's just sort of been a thing for a very long time. But, I mean, if you want to sort of start from the sort of Middle Ages, if you like, where some of these grimoires first appeared. Now, grimoires are a book of magic, of course. Some of them may appear to have been used by some so-called witches. Others are more kind of folk practices that you wouldn't necessarily divide between medicine, if you like, and magic. There's quite similar, really. So it's one of those things you can't really position a particular point in history where witchcraft begins, but, and I mean, you can talk about things like where they're organised witch groups or the covens, that kind of thing, and really there's not a lot of evidence to suggest anything of the kind. It was often more individuals working by themselves rather than organised groups. It was it's one of those things that you kind of can look back into history and sort of point at what might be seen as witchcraft practices, but they could also be seen as just herbalists and collecting herbs and herbal remedies, casting spells, that kind of thing. Again, it's more historically anecdotal information rather than anything concrete that we can actually sort of lay our hands on as into origins. I mean, going back to what you said at the beginning with King James and his book on demonology, that was the kind of period in the 1600s where witchcraft practices were being seen as being more prevalent, shall we say, than they actually are, and would have been considered to be more dangerous than they actually were. But there's a lot more going on in those sort of times. It was often a way of getting rid of people you didn't particularly like, accuse them of practicing so-called witchcraft, as in define what the Bible said. And King James's book sort of codified the ideas of what could be taken as witchcraft, if you like. That was a kind of put together of, well, this is proof of witchcraft, that's proof of witchcraft, this is what you should look out for demonic possession and that kind of thing, without any real evidence to say any of it was actually real. It's a confusing time, shall we say, because there's not a lot of records of that period that you can really sort of say, well, there's this bit of proof, there's that bit of proof. I mean, around a similar time frame as King James's book, there was also The Discovery of Witchcraft, written by Reginald Scott, but his is the refutation of witchcraft. It isn't proof of witchcraft. What makes his book particularly interesting in the 1500s is that there is a large section of it that does include so-called magical spells, and some of it is clearly drawn from grimoires. But it was the first time anything like that suggesting that witches were using this stuff ever appeared in print. It's sort of almost like it was taken as read. This, of course, is true, but it's suddenly appeared now. It's a funny one, because it's almost, there are books about trying to trace the origins of Scott's witchcraft book, because it kind of pops up all of its own, if you like. There's little bits of pieces of evidence, but it's a little odd in that respect. But yeah, it kind of began that sort of reaction to witchcraft in more than the 1600s, around that kind of time frame you guys were talking about last week.
So what's the very first grimoire? Is that the one you talked about? Is that the first one?
Well, it's difficult to give a time and a date, because I think we really need to establish that witches don't use grimoires, or didn't use grimoires. They might do now retrospectively, but they didn't in those days, because most of them wouldn't be able to read. You're talking about material that was not readily available at all, if available at all. It was very much, grimoires of the old were handwritten, but they were written by scholars, if you like. It's more what I've said to you before about high magic and low magic, or folk magic. There's a difference. Grimoire magic is more ceremonial high magic. It's the sort of thing that was practiced by richer people, the gentry, if you like, if it was used at all. It was much more that kind of thing. Low magic or folk magic is much less structured. It wasn't they didn't have particular books of spells. It's one of those things that you see on TV and in movies these days, those ideas, but they are modern ideas sort of sent back in time. There was no evidence of it being that way. I mean, you can talk about grimoires themselves. They kind of pop up around about the 1400s early on. It's not really until printing becomes a thing, if you like, until sometime later that they start to spread around as what are called chapbooks, which are very cheaply produced books. But again, there's not many of them in English. They tended to be on mainland Europe. You'd find these things popping up. So witchcraft in England wasn't that well, or those kind of books weren't that well known in the UK. And to some extent, Reginald Scott's book I mentioned before, The Discovery of Witchcraft, he draws information from those medieval grimoires, the chapbooks that popped up, as I say, in Europe. But he was a scholar, he was an intellectual. He could speak other languages, he could read them. Your average sort of Auntie Joe down the road in some small village somewhere, she wouldn't be able to read English, much less Latin. So, how the kind of spells that sort of lone witches of those days would have practiced were very much their own thing. It might have been handed down through the family, perhaps, or it was their own kind of researches into sort of spell crafting and herbs, that kind of thing. It's not that they didn't draw information from pre-existing texts. The text existed, but it wasn't the sort of thing they would access or got hold of. The grimoires we know of now, like the Book of Solomon and Goetia, etc., they didn't really pop up until the 16th, 17th century. There are earlier versions and pieces of them exist, things like Trithemius' Steganographia, which is seen as the origin of some of the Goetia stuff. But again, that was written in Latin in sort of Central Europe by Trithemius. that wasn't sort of thing you could get hold of easily at all over here. I mean, some would say that all Trithemius is actual writings and not just cryptography, they're coding, and there's no magic in there at all. I mean, it's an area of debate, but those are the earliest things. There's things like the Hagamentia, which appeared probably in about the sort of 1300s, which is, again, a source material for a lot of the grimoires, but it's in Latin again. It's not easily available to anybody who was sort of a folk magician in a little village somewhere. So, it's a different pathway. The two of them are quite different. But, retrospectively, we can look back and say, Mary Figgins, the witch, had a Book of Solomon in the 1800s. And the chances probably didn't. Probably had no access to it whatsoever. Yeah. I mean, you can draw a little bit of magical information from the Bible. There are kind of hints of stuff in there. No obvious spells, but you can see kind of magical ideas can be found in some of the New Testament material, and the Old Testament material, and you can kind of rework that, if you like, into some kind of magic. But when I'm talking about my own book, of course, but when I was compiling the Wiki Show of Decay, the collection of Victorian folklorists collecting spells and remedies, a lot of them are more rhymes than anything else. There's no kind of, with Goetic and Solomonic magic, there's lots of ritual pentagrams drawn in the ground and sort of different candles used. A lot of these things are no more than words. They're rhymes almost. A spell was simply a few words that were said in rhyme, no more than that. So sort of thing that anybody could create themselves. And I think often with someone who might have been seen as being a witch, just them saying something to you because you're afraid of them because they think they've got magical powers would be scary. They could make up their own rhyme on the spot, if you like. And if you believe they have that power, then of course it's going to work. So it's difficult to draw a proper history. I mean, obviously some writers have gone into great detail of trying to put together a history of witchcraft, but a lot of it's subjective. Again, you can't really nail it down that well.
So, like you talked about two pathways. So you've got like basically folk magic, which is magic that's sort of like passed down word of mouth.
Yes.
And then you've got the high path where they would do more, write down specific rituals with specific tools that you would need and that sort of thing.
Yes.
And the grimoires detail more of the high magic route.
Very much so. It's as again, it's to say that the work just weren't widely available. It was quite hard to get hold of. As I said before, obviously the advent of real printing, they were hand copied, handwritten. And one of the funny things that you can do, particularly with things like the Book of Solomon, perhaps the most widely known, is you can trace various versions across Europe. In fact, Stephen Skinner's book on the Book of Solomon traces the history of the various versions of the Key of Solomon that have floated around Europe. And there's more than 20 of them he's identified. And you can almost see the errors as they get repeated, the mistakes that are made compared to the previous version, the older version. So you end up with versions much more recently, like the version that was published by MacGregor Mathers in the 1890s. It's full of errors. Part of it's perhaps a bit of laziness on Mathers' part, but also it's because it's been copied after copy of a copy of a copy. So mistakes start to creep in. And yet those that have used Solomonic magic and would have used a Mathers version, because it was the first real English translation, have found they have success with it. It seems to be effective. So it doesn't have to be exactly correct for it to work, but it is interesting to see how there is no one Book of Solomon. There are lots of different variations with competing histories that could be of different ages. I can't be sure which is the first or original copy, if you like. As I say, the one that's interesting is the Hagamentia, which only really emerged relatively recently, but certainly it seems to be the oldest version of the Book of Solomon, and it's been floating around. I mean, the earliest, again, you can't be sure. The earliest quoted idea of a Solomonic magical book is the Testament of Solomon, which was supposedly written around the 3rd century AD. Although it's given the name Solomon, which causes a hint back to the ancient Jewish king of Israel. But he didn't write these books, and they attributed them to him, but they're nothing like as old as that. But again, the Testament, which is more of a collection of demons and how to control them, it could be as early as the 3rd century AD. So it potentially is the oldest one that's around, but again, you can't be absolutely sure of these dates. They are kind of generally agreed dates without being absolutely proven dates.
So they don't do like Book of Solomon version 1, version 2.
Volume 1.
Like these days, you'd get the revised version of the Book of Solomon. You know what I mean? Yeah. You're not getting that. And that's why it's so murky, is because they didn't timestamp, basically, their work.
Absolutely, yes. That is the thing, because a lot of this stuff was copied surreptitiously. Of course, we are still talking about times when the church was far more powerful than it is now. And, you could still be charged with witchcraft and devilry, even if you were a nobility, if you weren't very careful. These people would often get away with things that the average Joe public couldn't possibly get away with. But they have the limits, You had to be careful. But it's a difficult one to really trace a really defined history of either pathways, either the higher ceremonial magic or the low magic of the village witch. But one of the things often is talked about in the history of witchcraft is that there is a long, well-established history of covens practicing across Europe and the UK, and there isn't. The first real attempt to write about such things and make such claims was Margaret Murray back in 1917, when she wrote an article for the Folklore Journal, which was entitled, and I just find it because it's right in front of me because I have a first edition original copy, which is very nice, Organisation of Witches in Great Britain by Margaret Murray. It was a transcript of a talk she gave a few weeks before this was published in 1917. And she does try to put forward this notion that there was a long history of covens in the UK, and then in her first book on the topic in 1921 across Europe. But the research, she was known as a historian. She was an Egyptologist. It was what she's better known for before this. But something's wrong with the research. It just doesn't add up, and quite a lot of fellow researchers and historians of the time started to pick apart what she'd written, and it just started to fall apart. It was a strange kind of hope, if you like, or myth dressed up as fact, as real history. There just wasn't the evidence she was trying to make out. There's little bits and pieces. There's some examples of possible European witchcraft coven work in the Grimm's Teutonic mythologies. Now, the Brothers Grimm are better known for the Grimm fairy tales, which bases a lot of things like Disney movies, etc. They're well known for their fairy tales, but they also wrote the Teutonic mythology, which is more of a deeper, almost darker collection of tales and things to do with witchcraft and magic. And there are suggestions in there that there may have been some evidence of small covens operating in sort of Central Europe and Germany particularly. But again, it's scant, and it's not really, you can't absolutely prove it, but there's certainly very little evidence of it here. It tended to be, as I say, from my own research, the Victorians quoting earlier sources of individuals. There was no real obvious signs of what you might describe as a witch's coven. There are things like the Society of the Horseman's Word, which is horse-related magic that was sometimes practiced, but that was more of like a Freemason fraternity of horse workers, and they had things like the Bonesman, which was part of that, and the toe bone ritual, which became quite famous a few years back. But that again is an individual person performs a toe bone ritual, and the toe bone itself is supposed to help control horses, so it plays a part in that kind of idea, if you like. But it's a murky history to try and really find proper, genuine history. It gets, until you get into the 1900s, it's pretty difficult. And even then, as I say, with Margaret Murray's writings, it's still not definitive. It's kind of a bit vague, a bit wishy-washy, and unfortunately probably largely made up.
So with someone like Margaret Murray, there seems to be, and I believe this was with the grimoires sort of from the Middle Ages as well, so this is where perhaps sort of low magic and high magic, they're trying to legitimise it by giving it a provenance.
Yes, this is, you really hit the nail on the head, Richard. This is one of the things you find a lot in esoteric material in the occult, in writings and societies and groups that are formed. There seems to always be a need to prove history behind them. It has as an antecedent, they have to prove it's something that's been around for a very long time. It hasn't just been brought to light straight away. It kind of begins with the Theosophical Society. They were a kind of more intellectualized mystics, if you like, and they came about as a result of our Western UK interaction with the Middle East and then India, etc., kind of bringing those mystical ideas across. But they always had to have these ancient chiefs, secret chiefs, that were providing the information and knowledge. That carries on then with the Golden Dawn, which came into existence in 1888, but it couldn't just be an organisation that found some material from the Rosicrucians, which is maybe some of it's come from, but most of it's actually made up by them. Their own rituals and spells were created by the early founders of the Golden Dawn, but they invented a story in which they found this series of letters in a book that one of them purchased at Portobello Market that pointed to an organisation in Germany called the Golden Dawn that was a secret society, been going for a long time. They managed to get hold of the name of Fräulein Sprengel, I think her name was, but she was supposedly the head of the German equivalent of the Golden Dawn. They wrote to her asking permission to form a UK branch of the Golden Dawn. She basically wrote back and said, yes, you can. Here's some rituals, never write to me again, basically.
Oh.
Right.
Because we're dissolving, don't write to me ever again. But she didn't exist. There's no evidence for that. I can't remember the German version of the name, but there's no evidence for its existence whatsoever. It is purely begun in 1888 with the Golden Dawn, using some rituals that come from Freemasonry, and they've expanded upon those, because they wanted to create a society that practiced magic rather than just talked about it. And there's the Rosicrucian Society in Anglia, which is part of Freemasonry, which is a kind of magical, mystical arm, if you like, but it doesn't practice magic. It talks about it, but doesn't practice it. They wanted to form an organisation that did practice magic. So, but again, you see, there's this whole idea of having to prove an antecedent, having to prove a history to it. Gerald Gardner, who we'll probably talk a bit more later on, when he founded the Wicca movement, he couldn't just say, well, I've sort of put this together from texted information I've come across. No, he had to invent a coven that's supposed to have existed. Again, there's fragmentary evidence there might have been something going on in the New Forest around about the time he was writing in the early 30s when he first came up with the ideas. But there's no real evidence, again, for this covenant existing. But he almost like he felt he had to create this history in order to legitimise what he was doing, which you don't have to. It's unfortunate that people choose to do that. So they were always kind of scrabbling around for examples of historic proof of their existence that goes back long before they form. But they don't need to. But there's a common theme, if you like, that they do exactly that.
I have to say, though, I do think if you want something to be almost like legitimised, people do invent a history. That's just human nature almost, isn't it?
Well, I don't know. I mean, as I say, within this sort of esoteric world, it's become a necessary element. But even if you say, oh, it goes back 200 years back to, well, it still began somewhere. You know, it's still a beginning point.
Yes.
Does it mean if it was 200 years old, people were practicing it 180 years ago, they're less legitimate than you are because they only started it 20 years before they were practicing it? It doesn't work. You know, it's still legitimate. I mean, as you guys know, one of the areas I've written about the second edition of the book is about to come out on the runes, my book on Armanan runes. Now, again, there is a lot of, some runic magicians who use the Armanan runes who want to believe these are ancient proto-runes that Guido von List rediscovered magically, mystically. He didn't. He created them himself. There's no doubt about it as far as I'm concerned. He might have claimed it, but there's no evidence for them whatsoever before von List wrote in 1909 The Secret of the Runes. I don't have a problem with that. I have no problem. It still makes them over 100 years old, so they still have some history in that respect, but they are magical, mystical runes. They're not ancient. They don't need to be very good, to be usable. But there are those that will say, oh, no, these are the proto-runes from the beginnings, dawns of time. They're the earliest versions. That makes them more legitimate. You don't need it, but some people feel that you have to have that history. And I do think it's a trend that has come about really in the 20th century with magic. It didn't used to be like that.
Right. So going back to folk magic, that kind of evolves from healing, doesn't it? You know, the healer in the village, know about herbs and stuff like that, and be very in tune with nature and the cycles and stuff like that. And that sort of folk magic is sort of where it evolved from. Am I right in thinking that?
Yes. When you comes to things like herbal magic and folk magic in that respect of use of herbs, you're on much more sure footing, historically speaking. There are certainly documents that we can date back to Middle Ages and earlier that do talk about herbs and magic. There's a particular collection called the Leechcraft, Saxon Leechcraft. I've got volume 1 and 2 of it here. They go back to very old, ancient times, if you like, back to the time of the Saxons, obviously, from the name of it. It's written in Old English, and the manuscripts themselves are centuries old. They are definitely examples of magical practices with herbs, or what herbs can do magically. Now, some of it, of course, is basic medicine now that we've recognised as being herbal medicine that is actually working and effective. But it's almost like it's the one kind of sure footing you've got that you can find evidence of herbalists and their collections of work. And a lot of these people who would have been called witches of the village, most of it was herbal practices that they were doing. It was, again, what I looked at in the Folklore Society books from the 1800s, a lot of these are herb remedies that are talked about for ways of helping with maladies and illnesses, and a lot of it is to do with fortune telling as well. That's the big thing of witchcraft in those days. A lot of ways of seeing into the future, and most commonly, it was always about trying to find one's future love, who your husband's going to be, or your wife's going to be, or mainly husband actually. Most of these spells are more around those kind of lines. So it was more kind of sort of almost like tarot reading, relatively harmless stuff. But you say the herbal stuff, the healing stuff, is probably the most surest footed historic material you can actually get hold of, because there are very definite manuscripts that are around that talk about herb and herb craft. So that's probably the firmest part of the path, if you like.
I mean, when we was looking at the origins of Halloween and the Celts and the leader, the seer, shaman, Druid, whatever you want to class them as, their leader would, be very much involved in this kind of practice as well. And when you start looking at it, you can see threads coming through from all of these different cultures. And this is low magic. This is low magic, not high magic. So, this is where we start to see a very definite difference between the different methods of approaching magical practice. And it's fascinating actually to see that evolution through, and that it still went on in villages all the way through, didn't it? But this is where it created that cultural and political issue in regards to the church, wasn't it? Because the church obviously held power. And talk to us a little bit about that side of things, the cultural and political landscape, where they was trying to subdue the folk magic.
It's an interesting thing that often in modern times we almost have the idea of magic and witchcraft versus or against opposing the church. It was not the case at all in the sort of older times, if you like, certainly in sort of the time that I was talking about, the sort of 1700s, 1800s. It could very much be a folk magic practitioner, but also go to church on Sunday. There was no problem with the two. They didn't seem to be conflicted. Because if you think about it, going to church is all the kind of high theory of God and that kind of religious worship. Whereas magic, for these people, was practical, down-to-earth, day-to-day stuff. There was no conflict between the two at all. The idea of what's called the dual observance. You could very much be a Christian and practice magic. There was no conflict there. As long as you didn't kind of step out of line, if you didn't become too obvious, if you didn't do anything too publicly, if you did, you were then seen, of course, on a number of levels. The problem with the church, first of all, the church would see anything magical as being ultimately the work of the devil anyway, instantly. There was no argument there. But also it was a threat to their authority. The church was the absolute authority and power. They're the only ones who could grant healing. They're the only ones who could sort of save you. So anyone who was doing something that appeared to be usurping the power of the church was in trouble. So for the individual practitioner of magic, it was okay to do the two. For the church, less so. Although there are examples, I can't go into a lot of detail here, but there are definitely examples of church vicars who also practice magic, because they didn't see it as being particularly a bad thing. Because often you were dealing with people who were ill, and this is commonly the only way they could get help. There was no NHS, there was no medical services available, and sometimes it was legal as well. There was no law or legal redress to do with something. Obviously there was law, but there was no one to enforce it. There wasn't any village bobby around, so sometimes the threat of being cursed through magic was seen as sufficient to people to admit a crime, that they would be cursed, they would be in trouble, a spell would be put against them if they didn't confess to the crime or didn't come forward. So it was a way of keeping people almost in line as well, and the church played its own part in that as well. Because it is easy for us to not see how powerful the church was, not just the high church of St Paul's Cathedral in London, but the local village church and the village vicar was powerful. They could, you would be cast out from the church, you're cast out of the community. So, they had power, and you want to kind of keep them in line. So you'd tread a careful path. You'd have to be quite a brave soul to really step out alone with the church, but at the same time, the church wouldn't necessarily kick you out if you were still towing their line. So it was a kind of an easy relationship, shall we say? I
suppose the church would look at it if their sort of like congregation didn't bother them too much. They sort of went to the local practitioner for their everyday maladies and perhaps a little bit of foretelling. And as you say, it seems very sort of mundane. And they would sort of like the women would ask and who their potential husbands might be and stuff like that. So I can possibly see the church not having a problem with that, because it sort of like leaves the church to do its more sort of churchy stuff.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it was safe. I mean, what a common spell you come across is the thing to try and help crops grow and for the cows to produce more milk. So it's beneficial for the village. That was seen as helpful magic, and the sort of more negative malady magic was something different that was much more sort of hidden away. But again, still existed, still practiced. But you could sometimes find the particularly the older woman who was seen as the witch, her power could be legendary. And it could be opposing the church, and it could almost be like a battle between the witch of the village and the church, who was actually more in control of what happened in the village. And, we took a small rural community. The church was quite detached from like sort of higher authority. You might never see the local bishop maybe once every 5 years or something, wasn't a common feature. And sometimes, it was almost as if it was a kind of a mark of power to say that she wasn't afraid of the church. It was often she as well. It was a common thing in witches tend to be women, but not always at all. A lot of male witches, in sort of inverted commas, were present. They were more kind of what you'd call the cunning man of a village. Mm-hmm. They were more wise woman, and cunning man was a better terminology. That again, you can kind of split between the idea of a witch and a wise woman. The wise woman is beneficial to the village. She is the one that does care about it and looks after the crops. The witch is someone a bit more, not so nice. But again, it's not a cut and dry, precise division. You do get
a slight sort of crossover because you can see sort of like the older, wiser sort of woman, because there's a lot of talk, about midwives, and they would have been older, experienced women, wouldn't they? And and there was like an association, if you were a midwife, that could carry some sort of a sort of darker power behind it.
Yeah, that would be a common practice of the wise women of the village, would be very often involved in childbirth, because again, there was no health service, there was nothing, so they would play their part in that.
Paul?
Yeah, as Richard said, there is some sort of crossover, isn't there? Because I've noticed, as you've been talking, I've seen like from the origins where it's almost like trial and error to try and find things that would heal people. So like they have an upset stomach, they would find something that would cure that. So it's gone from that, and then you brought into religion into it as well, and it almost seems like it's a mishmash of religion as well. Because, absolutely. Going back to maybe like the Romans and the Greeks, they had separate gods to pray to for different things. For like like crops. If they wanted crops to grow, they would go and pray to their Ceres or something, I think it was called. Their god. So it's sort of a mishmash of all that, all this magic stuff.
Oh yeah, absolutely. As I say, you can draw stuff from the Bible that can be seen as useful for witchcraft practice. I mean, often the things that the Romans and the Greeks that were kind of abandoned, obviously, when Christianity became the power and the force. But it is, there's no sort of one special book of magic you can go to that all these people use. Not what you do today, because the bookshop will get you your spell book. But in those days, it didn't happen that way. It was often remedies that were handed across from sort of family to family, and so that sort of the area.
I think that's why it's so hard to pinpoint it to particularly one place or one person to actually start this whole magic thing off.
Absolutely,
and because it is literally just hearsay, and it's a case of I've got a stomachache, and they're like, suck on that leaf.
Yeah.
Do the world of good.
Yeah.
My mother swore by it, and I bet she did. I bet she said, "What the bloody hell's that?"
It is one of those things. The trial and error bit is the interesting thing. Is like, who were the errors? What went wrong? You don't want to think about it.
Oh yeah, you don't really want to sort of go down that route, but
But it really isn't until the Victorian age where folklore interest. I mean, we all talk about history now. That history is essential, very important to us all. It didn't used to be. It's only really until the Victorian age where people started to have actual leisure time. I mean, I don't mean the average sort of worker down the factory, because of course he was there from sort of dawn till dusk every day, 7 days a week. But with the advent of the industrial age, there were a lot more people were becoming reasonably wealthy that were able to have leisure time and leisure interests. And things like tracing folklore history didn't really become popular until then. And these Victorian folklorists, they were gathering information that had never been written down before, never been collected before. And you do see a pattern that does kind of evolve, but it is more of a case of not organised covens, as Margaret Murray would have us believe, but more just communication between village to the next village. You know, there might be a wise woman of one village who might visit maybe 3 or 4, and then someone might make a note of some of the things she's done and then try them themselves. So it kind of spread organically. It wasn't kind of structured. But I say these early folklore books from the Victorian age, they are gold mines for this kind of information. This real, what you would call low history. Much of history before them was written from the top down, from like the rulers who won the wars. You know, there was not a lot of focus on the average Joe public. This folklore is history the other way around. It is rooted in sort of day-to-day life and how culture worked. And one of the other really important writers in this period is John Ewart Evans. His collection of books on folklore, it's more recent. It's much more recent actually. It's more like the 30s. But he went out to record this history because he was very concerned it was going to disappear. And he writes a lot of stuff that's more to do with like horse magic. Is one of the things that crop up a lot in his writings. But it is source material for, again, older magical practices that may have become lost in the modern age. Excuse me.
So we've got this mishmash that's evolving through. When does it start becoming more in conflict, should I say? When does the sinister side of this come through, that it becomes out of favour to be the local healer or local witch? When does the terminology of this change? Because, you know, up to now it sounds very very positive. You know, they're able to practice, they're going to church, everything seems in balance. You know, so when does this change into the more sinister tones of you're a witch kind of thing?
I don't know, to be honest with you. It's kind of hard to pinpoint because, in the conversation we had before we did the show, that it is much more to do with politics than it is to do with actual practices. It was more to do with control. You know, it gets quite complicated. You're tying things like the Spanish Inquisition or that kind of stuff. The Spanish Inquisition is often seen as this Catholic faith in mainland Europe, not really here, but trying to destroy the magic of power of witches and that kind of stuff. It's not really true. That was more about the battle between Spain and Rome for the power of Europe. Which was ruling over the Pope in Rome, or the Spanish royal family were controlling the Catholic Church, if you like, who was the more powerful. And these people kind of get dragged into it. I mean, you've got things like the Manifest Maleficarum, which is the Hammer of the Witches, which is how to find witches and how to burn them and destroy them, as if there's millions of them all over the place. There's not. You know, it becomes a way of just sort of getting rid of people you don't like very much. You know, the strange old crone at the end of the village, or the person who's got more land than you've got. You know, we're accusing of witchcraft. It'll be believed because of this Spanish Inquisition that's going on, and they'll be got rid of. You know, it didn't happen here so much, but it's still present to this idea of you call someone a witch, off they go. I mean, a good example, of course, is Salem in Massachusetts. What happened there? Again, it was more hysteria. It was more about, there's some theorising it was some kind of illness that was causing delusions that actually caused a lot of these things. But again, it became the case that, the church trying to control these people. So if you point the finger at someone and say they're a witch, automatically, you know, if he's definitely a witch, they get burned at the stake and killed and what have you. But again, the actual records show there were nothing like as many deaths as we are led to believe. And again, in Central Europe, again, there was far fewer actual deaths than actually really occurred. We have this sort of bogey monster here of Matthew Hopkins, Witchfinder, you know, finding gets them burned. But he's a bit of a mystery because he kind of pops up out of nowhere and then disappears again. You know, it's almost like, did he actually exist as one person? He's like an evil version of Robin Hood. Lots of competing versions of the story, and all these hundreds of people he sentenced to death, and Again, there's no real record. There's a few people, again, more kind of people that were irritating, want to get rid of more the weirdo at the end of the village. They're the ones that were being killed off. There's a lot of, it's a lot of conflation of information kind of merged together and confusing because there's not a lot of actual written records again.
So how do we get from Spanish, and conflict, with the Pope to what became an horrendous time in history where you say that, there's not as many as you think. There's still a hell of a lot of women did get killed. And these are folk people. These are not rich people that have got power as such. So how did we get from that to that?
You assert dominance of the church again. It's how almost a fascist state acts. You gather up a few people, doesn't matter who they are, execute them in the middle of the village, and the rest of the village will do what you're told because they've been, you see what happens if you don't. It's power. It's all about power and control again. And these are easy, vulnerable targets. Little old woman, living on her own. Who's going to stand up for her? Nobody. So we'll burn her, you see some of the old Hammer horror films. It's always this sort of buxom young woman. She's been accused of witchcraft and gets stuck on the stake. It didn't happen that way. The reports that exist, not there are many, but reports that do exist, it was often the old crone into the village who wanted to get rid of. She's an old woman, her husband's died, and she's controlling the land that was his, and someone else wants it. She's a witch, get rid of her, burn her. And of course, then she's gone. And the church agreed because it's a chance for them to exercise their power and take over control. So, it's difficult to capitalize it in a short period of time. This is like a series of lectures on that topic. You can really cover an awful lot of material. We're trying to squeeze a lot of information into a relatively small period of time. In terms of our time, not in terms of history. You are hundreds of years again.
Yeah, this is the thing. It does encompass a long period of history of evolution of ideas and power struggles that go on politically and culturally, and it does encompass a lot of things, and the witch thing gets caught up with all of this and gets almost like very that's what confuses the issue. And then you get books like what James I wrote, which kind of inflamed it in the UK. It becomes quite murky, and like you say, without any written records of a definitive history, we do lose it, don't we? We've lost it.
Yeah. You've got to think also with James I, you're talking about Catholics versus Protestants in the UK. It's more political game playing again. It's more power grabbing again because the Catholic Church is trying to reassert itself after because of the split in the church. So it's all politics again. It all get drawn into it. James had the fear of witches. There's no doubt about it. He saw it as being everywhere, but doesn't say it was everywhere just because he thought it was.
Richard?
Yeah. We see a time sort of around this time. There's certainly people actually taking precautions against sort of witchcraft and stuff. Quite sort of lay people, and what I'm trying to get at here is sort of things being deposited round your house and stuff. People that own sort of houses and old houses particularly finding things under hearths and in doorways and stuff like that. And can you trace that down to a particular time when this sort of practice started, or does that sort of go back a longer way? Because what I'm finding here is, there seems to be a general acceptance, and then all of a sudden people seem to be quite sort of lay people are starting to try and protect themselves from it.
Well, it's a difficult one because you can find these kind of household magical spells to protect the home and the hearth go back to prehistory again. You're talking about this stuff in Babylonian and Sumerian periods of a similar kind of thing. Often a common thing in Babylonian times was called the devil bowl, which is a bowl with inscriptions on the inside, which you then turn upside down and put in the front of the house. So it's sort of buried into the ground. It would trap any devils and demons trying to come into the house, into the bowl itself. So, they're ancient. They go back thousands of years. So it's a practice that's gone on for a long period of time. You can't find a definitive point where this sort of practice begun. But the idea of luck and charms and tokens are all about trying to control the elements around us, trying to control things we don't understand, trying to find ways of controlling these things and protecting the home by supernatural means. If you protect it because you believe it's going to work and the person in the village thinks this stuff works, and of course they're going to be believing that it's going to affect them. You can go down to a deeper level whereby there's I think you can find that these things do cause atmosphere to change. I mean, this is again probably another interview entirely, but the idea of how magic does actually alter the local energy field around a place and the situation and people. I think there's real evidence that it does do that. How and why, I don't know, but it does seem to happen. So
it seems quite, I can understand what you're getting at, because especially around houses and sort of stuff, sort of like the 17th century, thresholds are very important to protect, aren't they?
Absolutely.
It seems like the chimney, sort of anywhere that has access to an open to the outside.
And again, you have to think these are times where there was no police. There was no, you couldn't call, if you think a house is threatened or someone's going to break in, there was no protection whatsoever of the law. It just wasn't there. So you have to find other means to protect yourself. And if you remember, if these people firmly believe this sort of magic was going to work, it may well work because they believe it's going to work. But it's one of those things, you can try it. You've got nothing to lose if you don't try it and it doesn't work. If you don't try it, it's not going to work. If you try it, it might work. So what do? You must try it.
God, that sounds like the lottery to me.
Exactly.
There's got to be in it to win it, everybody.
I think I've often found sort of, especially like the 17th century sort of bottles, which are sort of still found to this day in the Bellarmine sort of jugs and stuff. They seem to have the oddest ingredients in them, if you can call them ingredients. Usually I sort of tend to read it's urine, and it's usually a mixture of urine, pins and human hair. Is there any particular reason for these sorts of contents?
Well, the pinning down of things with the needles and the pins, again, is a biblical thing. The idea of the iron can actually hold things down and hold the spirits back. Things like hair and urine, they're personal. They are. A witch bottle is usually used as a way of getting at somebody to cause them harm. You've got their hair and their other bodily parts, body functions in the jar. It connects them to that particular object. They can sometimes be used by protecting a person, because if you've got their personal elements within it, they are also then protected by it. So that's why those things are used, because it connects with you. But the nails are often, because it pins things down, there's an idea of the devil can be stopped with iron, that kind of thing. That kind of plays a part. But again,
that goes
because
back to Fey law though as well, doesn't it?
Say again?
That goes back to Fey law.
Oh yes, still fairies, yes. It's all intertwined into it. Again, it's one of those things, you can find the books that talk about this sort of stuff, but they're retrospective. They're going back to what they've seen previously, what's been written about. They're not origin books. Like the witch bottle itself is a good example, because it appears the first time mentioned in the book from 1578, I think it is, the Triumphatus. It talks about witch bottles as if everyone knows what they are, as if they're well known, but they've never been mentioned before. But it was the first time they actually appeared in print. But again, like with Reginald Scott's Chapter Witchcraft, the stuff he talked about it was like it was already known about. And yet this is the first time it's appeared in writing. It's one of those strange things. It clearly was something around. There were some ideas about it, but it's the first time it's really been written about. And so the witch bottle is talked about in that book as if, well, this is the rest of it, but everyone knows what it is anyway. It's like, well, do they? It's never been talked about before.
So this is the thing where we've then gone from what was common practice and nobody thought to write down. And then all of a sudden we start writing it down as if we should know what it's all about. And that knowledge has kind of been lost as to the origins of that and why you do that and what you should put in it and all that sort of thing has been lost, because when it was recorded, it was almost like accepted that you should know that.
Yes.
Yes?
Essentially, yes. It's kind of, as I say, gathering knowledge that was out there, but we didn't know about, or there was no kind of previously written source. I've just grabbed the Trumpetus. I've got an edition of it. It's originally from 1689, The Full Unplain Evidence Concerning Witches and Apparitions by John Glanville wrote this. And as I say, it talks about elements of witchcraft and magic, but they say it's best known for that first ever writing about the witchcraft bottle. But you've also got people like Daniel Defoe, who's best known for writing, obviously, Robinson Crusoe. He wrote a book about
you ready to go
to the coffee again?
All right.
A System of Magic. A System of Magic, which he wrote. in, this edition was published in 1840. You know, it kind of pops up, and again, it details stuff that seems to have been known or should have been known about for a long time. It's again, he was very much kind of folklorist of his own, in a sense. He used to like to go out to the country and recall what was around him. I mean, quite interesting, he also wrote about our part of the world, Essex, and the way he described us was quite disturbing, actually.
Yeah, especially down your way as well, wasn't it? When he walked along the Thames Estuary. That is one of my favourite parts from that book. Was it a tour of the islands of Britain, isn't it?
Yes, basically, yeah. It is. Again, he was kind of information gathering himself then, and the thing is, his system of magic itself, it details stuff that's kind of almost as if it was well known about. But again, he quotes stuff from the Bible, which shows examples of which is kind of magic that's in the Bible. So, you know, this stuff is it's been around, but it's not coherent. It's not like there are, like we have today with groups, covens who might use the same book, if you like, because it's been published by Wise or something like that. You know, there are modern systems of magic that are codified into particular volumes, and you can buy it whether you live in Newcastle or somewhere in West Virginia, for example. You can get the same information. This is all kind of localized and kind of crosses over, and sometimes you have similar ideas popping up in different parts of the country. Sometimes they're very different ideas, fairly local to each other. So it's not coherent, not kind of planned out, but I say it pops up because it's. And obviously, you are always, when you're writing in the 16, 17, 1800s, you're always running into danger of the church because of its power. It's seen as its authority, and you're questioning its authority because as far as the church is concerned, it's all the work of the devil. You know, there's no folk magic that's harmless. In terms of biblical scholastic ideas, it's not harmless stuff. It's all dangerous and it's the work of the devil. What was on the ground, if you like, the people, how they saw it was different. You know, as we were saying before, the local churchman might even turn to the help of the wise woman in the village with a particular problem. He wouldn't see it as being a difficult conflict, but it wouldn't be something that would be sanctioned by the bishop, shall we say. It would have to be at a very much low level.
Did people that practice this low magic, you know, the folk magic, did they believe that they were sort of like getting into some sort of communication with external sort of spirits, sprites, or whatever you like to call it?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, a lot of we're talking about the folk magic is more to do with healing and prediction. It wasn't necessarily working with some kind of devil or spirit particularly. Again, we have stories of witches and familiars, but again, how much is that Hollywoodization of the truth? How much is that actually real? Again, people had their pets, you know, whether your pet cat or whatever, your pet frog. It didn't necessarily mean it was your witch's familiar that was somehow possessed by a spirit. You know, so it is a difficult one. Again, we talked before about things like ghosts and the supernatural seen in folklore eyes. It seems quite different to how we see it. It seems much closer linked, if you like. It is magical practice in itself. There's connection with ghosts and how you get rid of spirits and that kind of thing. It is more interlinked, but you don't. I mean, you could say it's one of the things that defines between folk magic and high magic or ceremonial magic, because ceremonial magic is designed specifically to deal with actual angels and supernatural beings, you know, devils and demons, etc., whereas folk magic is less so. If anything, it's only warding off and fighting against. I mean, my book has got a whole chapter on sort of battling and getting rid of the devil and dispelling the devil's work, that kind of thing. So in that respect, it's quite closely aligned with the church.
On that note, we're actually going to take a quick break, so join us straight after this.
Hello, Harry Price here. If there's nothing me and my friends enjoy more here on the other side, it is to sit back and relax and listen to the Paranormal Concept Show, right here on the PA UK radio network. Broadcasting a plethora of interesting and informative content for all your paranormal needs. Find them across social media to keep up to date with forthcoming shows and all their other adventures. Hello, is there anybody there?
And welcome back to the Paranormal Concept Show, exclusive to the Paranormal UK radio network. Now, before the break, we kind of started to get the idea that it's a reconstructed history, and with lots of gaps and lots of people sticking their oar in without real facts, without real timeline of evolution. It's all a bit hodgepodge that's been thrown together and no real roots in it as per se that you can trace back, right?
Mm-hmm. That's pretty much a good summary of the whole thing. Yes, it's reconstructed is a good word because it is. We've got this stuff now. We want to figure out where it came from. We can't quite work it out, so we're going to kind of make it up a little bit. I mean, a classic example, I mean, just a little sideline, is modern Druidism. The Druids of now would claim that they are ancient, go back to bardic history in Wales, etc., and that kind of stuff. Modern Druidism is based on a book written in the Victorian times when the Druidism first kind of came back, the Druids, and it's all made up. It really is made up. There can be elements of folklore that's known about, but you're talking about sort of Roman Britain, what they're trying to claim they go back to. There's nothing written from those times you can possibly point to as being genuine. It's pretty much entirely made up. But they felt the need to it. They would call it a reconstruction of what ancient Druidism was about. I mean, it might be. It might be exactly what it was like, but we've no way of knowing. So that's a good example of that kind of reconstructed history that you find common in the history of witchcraft, because people want a history that they can point to. It evolved organically, if you like, kind of came together, is now classified as folk magic and witchcraft, but these practitioners wouldn't have called themselves witches, not in those times at all. The cunning man is a term, or the wise woman was more the term you may come across, but you don't come across that term witch in that respect. I mean, it's an old term, it's in the Bible, but it is seen as of a dark, malevolent power, if you like, a wielder of dark forces in league with the devil, etc., etc. That's how witchcraft is portrayed by the church. So, you know, these people wouldn't have used that term, and it would be quite shocking to them. To us, it doesn't mean a bloody thing now, but in the old times, it would be quite a shocking thing to say someone's a witch.
You mentioned a very relevant term there for what we're going to go on to talk about next, which was the Cunning Man. Now, we've got a very famous Cunning Man amongst us, or an ancestor of a very famous Cunning Man, don't we, Andy?
It isn't really my great-grandfather. I just made it up.
Did you?
Oh, yeah, of course.
No way.
Yeah, sorry.
You've heard it here first.
Yeah.
Totally had on that.
Oh, dear. That would be nice if it was. But
very disappointed now. Very disappointed.
Yes, I've claimed it for many, many years. I mean, I have a bit of an odd history of my own. My own persistence is a bit strange, so there was no way of proving or disproving it was the case. But I would like to claim it was my great-grandfather. But yes, we have what would be described as the last real cunning man, which was James Morrell, who lived just down the road from us in Hadley. We're all in South Essex, of course, apart from, we're from South Essex, and not all of us are in South Essex at the moment, but we're all from And yes, he was very much the cunning man of the village there, and Hadley. He became quite famous for his dabblings with magic. He was born in the late 1700s, 1785, and so he lived in most of his life in Hadley in Essex, just down the road from here. He was a fascinating man. He interesting what we were saying before about use of Solomonic magic, etc. He was kind of a crossover. We certainly, from what little we have left of his own personal workings, is a single page, I think it's 2 pages, tell a lie, that come from a book that was written in 1809 called The Magus by Francis Barrett. Now, in the early 1800s, there was, again, as we were saying in the first half, a real interest in folklore and magic because of the rise of the middle class, who had a little bit of income, it was spare beyond sort of paying for food, etc., and had free time to indulge in hobbies and interests. And an interest in magic, as I say, in the early 1800s and late 1700s, began to grow because it was something you could have an interest in, if you like. And Francis Barrett wrote, or compiled, really is a better way of putting it, a book called The Magus. Now, it's based partly on material from a guy called Cornelius Agrippa, who wrote the 3 books of occult philosophy, which was written in a while ago, the 1700s, and was published in his original German and was translated into English and became available over here. And it's clear that Francis Barrett borrowed heavily from that. Also some stuff from Trithemius I mentioned in the first half. And again, some elements of grimoire magic which would have been produced by or written out by a guy called Frederick Hockley, who was a dab hand at copying these medieval handwritten manuscripts, the books of magic and things like books of Solomon and books like that. And he would meticulously reproduce volumes that were held in places like the British Library, and he would basically do them for a fee. Obviously, he got paid by people to do them, but also did them for himself. And I am quite an avid collector of Frederick Hockley original manuscripts, not the actual original manuscripts, they're gold dust, but reproductions of the original handwritten manuscripts. And clearly, Francis Barrett was in that kind of circle of the late 1700s of these kind of practitioners who would study magic, but at the higher level, if you like, the ceremonial stuff I talked about before. And it seems to be, we know Morrell lived for a period of time, well, he's worked for a period of time in London and then came back again to Essex. And he must have got hold of a copy of Francis Barrett's The Magus, because this single page is a hand-written, hand-drawn version of a page from the Magus. So he was blending folk magic of his area and time with the higher ceremonial magic. So there is where you get that kind of crossover actually happening.
Right.
This was being the early 1800s. He was active. He was, again, kind of a doctor, but they weren't quite a doctor, if you like. He was offering local remedies, going back to the herb stuff we were talking about before. He clearly was a herbalist. He actually had a copy of a book called Culpeper's Herbal, which was published in the 1700s, and that is a book of herbs, but it also includes sections about times of the day and times of the month that are the best to harvest for the most potent form. So that was a magical text in itself as well.
So he was sort of educated to an extent.
Oh yeah. I mean, he obviously could read and write, and had acquired some magical knowledge, partly from sort of locals, if you like, but also he was able to read and purchase and have copies of these texts, as I say. There is a reference, there's a guy called Arthur Morrison who wrote a book called Cunning Man, which is more of a fictionalized account of Morrell's life, but it's based around Morrell's life, and he believed he saw a book of Solomon that was in the possession of Cunning Man, so James Morrell, Cunning Man. So he may well have had a version of the Book of Solomon, but he certainly had a copy of the Magus, because we've got a picture of him actually, his hand-drawn version of it.
Right. So what do we actually know about Morrell other than his magical learnings on these 2 pages? What do we know of him as a person?
A fair bit. He was married, had quite a few kids. He was seen as, he called himself the Devil's Master, which is a kind of indication of how he saw himself having sort of magical ability. He claimed to have been able to see from afar. He had what probably was a primitive telescope he'd made himself, but he could claim to be able to see great distances and travel at great speed, almost like teleporting. I mean, there are, again, anecdotal stories of him appearing in 2 places at once and that kind of thing. So he was seen as having great power and ability, whether it was real or was just kind of made up, God alone knows. But he certainly seemed to create that kind of image for people. Also, he was quite a dumb hand at the witch bottle, as we were talking about before, but his was a very specific version of the witch bottle, which was very much to break curses. And if a person believed they were cursed, to go to him, he would have a local blacksmith who make these metal bottles rather than glass or bellowing jars. There were metal bottles in which there were pieces of things like hair and urine, etc., that belonged to the person who believed they'd been cursed. And the idea was the bottle would be placed in a fire and heated until the bottle burst. And when the bottle burst, the curse would be lifted, and the witch, very much a witch who'd cast the spell, would either drop dead or appear at the door in great pain or great agony, tied in with the explosion of the bottle.
Quite dodgy practice.
Quite effective, apparently. Well, again, it was interesting because there's a little bit of evidence to suggest the blacksmith who he was using, his name completely slips my mind at the moment, but he may well have had certain magical practices himself. He may well have had links to the Horseman's Word because he was a blacksmith. You know, he was actually making horseshoes and may have been part of the Horseman's Word, because we know the Horseman's Word Society kind of originates in Scotland, but also made its way down to East Anglia, our very region. And it's possible this blacksmith, whose name has completely escaped me at the moment, was a member of the Horseman's Norseman's word, so he had magical connections of his own. But a little interesting story, he was quite effective and successful with these bottles, which probably had a hole in them to let some of the gas out. So when it did pop, it wasn't a big problem. Cunning Morrell's eldest son wanted to carry on his father's tradition of the witch bottle in particular and using the same blacksmith. But the blacksmith who'd made them for Cunning Morrell was no longer alive, so he used a different blacksmith, and they made a slight mistake. They didn't leave the hole in the metal bottle to allow some of the steam out. As a consequence, it was placed on a fire, waiting to break the spell. It exploded and blew down half the bloke's cottage. It blew the wall up. So it was like, I think I might not bother trying to follow my father's footsteps after all. So that was smart, a common thing he was known for doing, was the witch bottle breaking of curses. But other things, he certainly had connections with another town which has become synonymous with witchcraft, Canuden. A regular visitor there, and probably had family in the area. Now, there's a very good reason why I mentioned Canuden, because there is another supposed cunning man who I personally believe is completely mistaken. He's become synonymous with the idea of the cunning man and folk magic of Essex, and that's a guy called George Pickingill. Now, George Pickingill grew up, again, was born in Hockley, lived in Canuden, but was about 50 years later than Cunning Morrell. He has been cited by a number of writers, including Gardner, Joe Gardner mentioned before, as being the source of some of the information about witchcraft, particularly in the 1960s when a chap called Eric Maple, who was quite a famous folklorist who was also a resident of Essex, started to write about Cunning Morrell. Pickingill. He is featured in the Folklore magazine, where Morrell was also talked about, and wrote separate articles for the local newspaper and a number of books, all talking about the magic of George Pickingill. The trouble is, if you look at Pickingill's life, there is nothing about him having any kind of cunning craft or running a coven or anything like that. In his own lifetime, he's only known for a couple of things. One of being very tall, well over 6 foot, having supposedly lived to more than 100 years old, although in actual fact it's unlikely he lived that long, and being photographed as seeing one of the very first motor cars in the area. There's quite a famous photograph of him standing outside of a little hut in his long coat, walkie stick and hat, but it's only much later on he becomes identified as being this magical character with these great abilities, and this coven that followed him in the 1970s. A chap called Bill Liddell also wrote about him as having been this great magician who had links to Aleister Crowley and the Golden Dawn, all that kind of stuff, which is patently nonsense. But he's become seen as this magical figure for quite a period of time. But the trouble is, many of the things he's supposed to have done in his lifetime were exactly the same thing that Cunning Morrell did about 50 years before. So it's no doubt in my mind that the two of them somehow become mixed up. People believe that things that are supposedly attributed to Pickingill were actually the work of James Morrell 50 years before. It's been compounded even further by, and I have great respect for the guy in every other aspect of his work, but Professor Ronald Hutton, who's become very well known as being a kind of a historian of folklorist of witchcraft and magic. He very much is adamant that he spoke to someone who lived in the Canuden village when he was younger, to an elderly woman who told him all these sorts of stories about George Pickingill. Except if you do the chronology of Ronald Hutton's life and age, he was about 14 when he spoke to this very elderly woman about this George Pickingill character. Though I think it's quite possible that either the woman misremembered or was just telling this school kid little porky pies, little stories. There's no way of proving it, because obviously she's long since passed. But to me, there is a problem here, and it's compounded all the more by a particularly very interesting book that I've got a copy of, which is called Essex. It's Forest Folk and Folklore, written in 1928. This is long before Pickingill suddenly appears as this so-called cunning man, and it describes in great detail the work of James Morrell, including stories about what Morrell was doing, including an appearance and disappearance and cursing in Canuden. That is almost word for word what Pickingill is supposed to have done. But Pickingill was written about doing these things until the 1960s. This book was written in 1928. There's not one word about George Pickingill in here, about Essex folklore magic. It's only talking about Cunning Morrell. So I think this book is absolute proof there's been a mistake been made here. that George Pickingill wasn't this great coven-leading witchcraft person at all. There's no evidence for it. In fact, you can go further. If you try to find George Pickingill the person, you can't. His name appears in historic records of the period and place, but there's different spellings. There's no uniform, absolute, definite, this is the one person. There are possibly more than one person who had the similar name. And you can't fully identify a single individual as being George Pickingill. I mean, so there's a famous photograph of him, and he's given dates of circa, not exact, but circa 1816 to 10th of April 1909. But there's no definite way of saying this is the same George Pickingill that's always been talked about. And to me, it's been controversial. It's caused a little bit of issues a few times when it's appeared in print, but how do you convince this guy is not this great supposed Cunning Man, that George Pickingill was nothing of the kind? It's all Cunning Man, and the two of somehow got mixed up. In fact, a good friend of mine, Richard Ward, wrote a series of articles for a magazine called The Cauldron a few years back that really outlined in detail the case against it, and Ron Hutton himself responded to it, and there was a series of communication. Unfortunately, the magazine actually came to an end fairly soon afterwards when the publisher Michael Howard, who also claimed very much initially that George Pickingill was definitely the right man, he passed away. But towards the end, even Michael Howard, one of his last books on magic and witchcraft, conceded that there may be something to the idea that the two have been confused. So for Michael Howard to say that was really quite significant. Ron Hutton tends to stick more to his belief that it was George Pickingill, partly because he's written so much about it. It's one of those things when you're an academic professor, you tend to stick to your guns on things, even if the evidence starts to pull apart, because it's all part of your image, if you like, as a professor of history. So I can understand why he's more reluctant, shall we say, to give up on the fact that George Pickingill may not be the right character, that Cunning Morrell is the proper Cunning Man. But I would absolutely stand by. I mean, I talk about it quite a bit in the back of my own book about the evidence, particularly the book I was talking about before by, I just remember her name now, C.C. Mason, written in 1928. If there was a folklorist collected in the 1920s in the Essex, why is there no mention of George Pickingill at all? Not one word, but yet there's half a dozen pages on Cunning Morrell. It makes you wonder there's something not right here. So, but for me, I found it fascinating. Again, this is this kind of trying to recreate history, trying to find the evidence for something, because there are all sorts of stories about George Pickingill's prayer out of all these covens of these 6 women in cloth and 6 women in satin, I think it is. Ideas 6 of them are rich, 6 of them are poor. Canewton's a tiny village in those days. It's nothing to it. It's a really small place. They have all these magical covens going on in there. The vicar's wife's supposed to be involved. It's like, really? It's not. I don't think it's just not credible to me. But I don't know.
It's still a very small place, isn't it? Sorry, Paul.
Oh yeah, even today it's pretty small.
A bunch of dodgy people in Canewton then.
Well, that's just all of Essex, really.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
No, it's not, obviously.
That's why I moved.
Oh, dear. So, oh, gosh, where do we go with that? Because this is a whole quagmire of, again, mixed history, isn't it? And again, it's not clear. It becomes murky in regards to where we go with this. So, James Morrell is predominantly southeast.
Yes.
Practicing basically curse-breaking witchcraft.
Yes.
And then we get confused with this guy Pickingill, which is later in history than him. Yeah. And it all becomes, again, a very murky kind of background that we're trying to unravel here. What do you guys help me out here? Where do we go? Where do we go from here?
I mean, you can talk about the fact that some of the Pickingill story becomes mixed up with Gerald Gardner's foundation of the Wicca movement, which came about in the early 1950s. I mean, one of the big things that happened in that time frame was the change of the law, that witchcraft practices, which were technically speaking outlawed, the law was changed to basically talk about fraudulent mediumship, which freed up people to finally actually talk about witchcraft openly without fear of prosecution. Because Gerald Gardner's first book was written attributed to a scribe, as in not known, not identified. It was a supposedly, quote, fictional tale of witchcraft, but it was his first kind of writings on what would become the Wicca movement. But it would say it was disguised because there was a chance of being prosecuted as being a witch. But when the law changed in the mid-50s, he was able to write publicly about what he believed and started to found the Wicca movement, if you like, as an established religion. But again, you see, he talks about Dorothy Clutterbuck, this New Forest witch that he learnt stuff from. You can't find it. Historically, there's no evidence for it. Recently, people have claimed to have found proof of the woman's existence, but again, it's all kind of very much after the fact. It's like almost, well, this is the evidence we want to find. Let's look and keep looking, and eventually you might find it. So, I know I'm being a bit cynical here, and I do get people who get me for this, but I stick to my guns completely. The Wicca was completely invented by George Gardner. It's done a damn good job. I mean, it's really, it's the only religion that the UK has given the world, but it is, and it's established. It's got millions of followers throughout the world now, but it is a religion. It's not just a witchcraft practice. It's codified as a faith. And you can actually put on the census you're Wiccan as your religion quite happily. It's accepted now as a religion. It's got things that believe in a particular lord and a lady. It's got it's got the deific spirits involved in it. So it's an alternative. It's not a Christian idea, if you like. But I tend to veer away from anything that's talks about lords and ladies and that kind of supernatural power. So it's not my thing at all. But it is. I mean, I've got first editions of his first two books in front of me here, Witchcraft and Witchcraft Today. They're both expensive to buy and pretty interesting to read, but it's fiction. It's not far off fiction. It's putting his crafted version of magic down, of witchcraft, but it's borrowed from history in terms of, some of the stuff is folklore based, but it's not genuine, real historic magic, witchcraft, which is what he would have you believe, based, again, going back to the beginning, on Margaret Murray's article about this witch cults of Western Europe, which again is largely made up. I'm always fascinated to know why she decided to do this, why she created this. I mean, she's known for her Egyptology, well respected for it, but the witchcraft stuff is strange, why she suddenly went down this path of this constructed history. But there you go.
Do you think that she came across some information that hadn't been privy to the public before, and that's what drove her?
Part of it, I suspect, yeah. She believed she'd found evidence of stuff. And, you found a few fragments of stuff and started to build a whole picture from the bits you've got without any real proof that it's there. And as I say, other contemporaries of her have tried to follow the tracks and just can't find this information she's talking about, this evidence she's brought forward. I mean, in the early part of the article, I'll just put it down now, I've lost it. She does outline, I'll read a couple of examples of historic evidence that she's found for this witchcraft practice. And as I say, these few bits and pieces that she's built this whole picture of what must be this incredible collection of magic. Things like from the 12th century, John of Salisbury mentions the witch's Sabbath, but doesn't quote where that's come from. John of Salisbury, 12th century, mentions witch's Sabbath. Where? What text? Where did you find that?
Yeah.
So it just popped up out of nowhere. It's almost like that. Literally is like, did he make it up? Did he have other knowledge that we don't know now?
15th century. He said. So that's where it come from, because he said it. She might have just jotted it down.
Yeah, but which John of Salisbury? Which one? The 12th century John of Salisbury mentions witch's Sabbath. In what text? Which John of Salisbury? Who's John of Salisbury when he's at home? 15th century trials of witches in Italy, France, and Germany. The characteristic features.
Yeah, we say that a lot for the paranormal,
Oh yeah.
It's like so and so said, and who's that then? Oh, he runs so and so paranormal. Yeah.
Just as things started to become a bit clear, they've all gone murky again.
Yeah. This is the frustrating part about all of this, isn't it? Let's be fair, guys. This is one of the most frustrating things, because even when we get somebody like James Morrell, it's tantalisingly close, but not close enough. And yet we get someone like, Margaret Murray or what's his face, Canuden guy, Pickering Gill. That's it. And then we've got stuff, but nothing backs that up.
Yeah.
So it becomes incredibly frustrating.
It's just hearsay. It's basically hearsay, particularly, as I say, the Picking stuff is based predominantly on the word of one person or two people who were both were elderly long after Picking had died, claiming he'd done X, Y, and Z. But there's no record of it at the time. There is, as I say, a record in the 1920s of Morrell's activity that's written down. So that has much better history than anything from Pickingill, because Pickingill goes back, starts in the 60s, and that's it. It's interesting because I think because it's not seen as particularly important history, not having particular relevance, as I said, because until very recently, the whole idea of history from the bottom up didn't exist. History was written from the top down, the kings and queens, the great battles, and who conquered who. The daily life of your average Joe Bloggs was irrelevant. No one was interested, or so they thought. And this is all part of the rise of the interest in folklore was the rise of the interest in history from the bottom.
And then this is the problem we have, because like you say, we're trying to reconstruct it from the little that we know. Exactly. So how much of it is massive jumps of assumption, and most of it by the sounds of it?
Well, yeah, I mean, you can draw threads and patterns. I mean, I've sat down, not for a long time, I did read this original organisation, which is in Great Britain, and you think, well, she's saying things, and then there's a few references at the bottom, but this needs a lot more referencing to actually be able to find what she's saying. It's interesting, but it's speculative. That's the thing. It's more of a speculative organisation of witches in Great Britain. It's not a definitive, but maybe because of who she was, it was seen as taken more seriously at the time. It was met with a lot of positive reviews. It's only when people started trying to dig into what she was saying, trying to find something, like that John of Salisbury reference, couldn't find anything. Couldn't find it.
There seems to be a reluctance for certain people to admit that there is no sort of real historical sort of concrete evidence to back any of this up. We've got what we've got, and you should just be happy with that.
It would be easier if you would just accept it. It might be a real history, it might not be. As I said, I've had endless debates with people about the Icelandic Runes. As I said earlier on, for me, they definitely are the invention of Guido von List in 1809. I don't see why that's a problem. But I've had some people vehemently argue, oh, no, these are the ancient proto-runes that predate all the other runic Futharks. These come before the Germanic Futhark, the Anglo-Saxon Futhark. As if there's 3 or 4, the Anglo-Saxon, which is varying numbers, the younger, which is 16 runes, and the elder, which is 24 runes, if they're the only versions anyway. That in itself is nonsense. There are dozens of different Futharks in history. A German researcher in the 30s, Sigurd Kummer, actually formed a chart of more than 20 different Futharks he'd discovered that were different to each other. Some letters were different. So, again, it's a reconstructed history, the idea that there's only very specific ones, and there isn't, not at all. So this kind of history is like, well, this is the definitive history. Well, it's not. It's fragmented. You can build a picture from the fragments, but the picture you build can be completely wrong. You can create something that isn't the case at all. As I say, like the confusion between Cunning Man and Pickingill. Now, you're talking about 150 years ago, when things were recorded. You talk about history of witchcraft 300 or 400 years ago. You're talking, vague at the best. How you can be definitively sure of anything of that kind of history. You really can't be.
No.
It's folk history, it's history of the land, it's history of the people. I mean, there are writers even today who will adamantly tell you that there is a long lineage and history to their witchcraft and magical practices that they can demonstrate. I mean, I don't want to name names, but one guy wrote a very good book quite recently. It was good. He definitely believes his stuff. He's done, he sees positive research, and it was got into the hands of an historian, and he's torn it to pieces. And he said, you're making all sorts of assumptions here. There's no proof of any of this at all. And it's like, oh, great.
So let's bring it up to the modern day. I mean, the individuals that practice witchcraft today. What is modern witchcraft today?
There are various versions, to be honest with you. You do have, of course, the standard Wicca approach, which has been codified as religion. It's often seen as almost like the gateway drug of witchcraft. It's your first way in. It used to be said of sort of higher magic that chaos magic was the way into the higher realms of sort of ceremonial magic. Well, Wicca is kind of the way into witchcraft. But there are different forms and variations. I mean, Garner had his own, which he began, and there are other people who come along a little bit later on. A prime example is, I can't remember the man's name. Robert Cochrane is his writing, Lee Bowers? Well, Robert Cochrane, we'll use that. It's his fake name. He created his own kind of reaction to it, in his own kind of what he called traditional witchcraft. That kind of began to emerge. You have Alexander Sanders, who more obviously mixed witchcraft ideas with ceremonial magic. His is much more codified as a magical system that is more akin to Golden Dawn-esque magic. There is definitely kind of that influences in there. He pops along in the 1960s as well, and his stuff's really good. I've got quite a few of his original diary. His original writings was published recently, always handwritten notes, and they're fascinating to read. So that's another kind of angle of the Alexandrian witchcraft, which is a bit more ceremonial based. And of course, coming into more recent times, you've got a number of figures who have established variations of what you might call traditional witchcraft, which does definitely encompass elements of the Victorian folk discoveries and writings. I mean, one particular person I know quite well is Gemma Gary, and her form of traditional witchcraft she's become very well known, very popular, and it's good. It's rooted more in historic folklore writers. Bothwell. Let me just go grab the book, see remember the exact title.
Go to the shelf.
Honestly, go to the shelf.
Popular romances of the West of England by, I'll say James Hunt. It's not James. He was a guy who rode motorbikes. Robert Hunt. Published in 1809. This is a collection of mainly stuff from sort of the West Country, old Cornwall. And this, along with the Bothwell book, whose title is getting my mind at the moment, of the fact of the material that Gemma first began to sort of draw from to formulate her own traditional witchcraft practices. So the traditional witchcraft, the traditional term is the idea is drawn a little bit more from historic documents and historic texts rather than made up stuff. So that's the different angle. Again, that you can go deeper. One area of magic I am particularly interested in is called Sabbatic Craft, which is resulting from the work of Andrew Chumley. Now, that too combines elements of high ceremonial magic with more kind of this folk magic we're talking about as well, and it also involved things like elements of voodoo come into it, and some of the old magic of Austin Spare, the artist, whose work kind of leans into the chaos stuff that I was talking about a moment ago.
So it becomes even more murky. I mean, we're talking more pulling elements in now, aren't we, from lots of different belief systems. So so it's becoming. It is becoming more and more murky.
Not so much belief systems, more practices, bringing elements of different practices together is a better way of putting it. And it's a positive synthesis. Now, there's a debate whether the Cult of Sabotage material is genuinely historic. There are some who tell you that it has got a history, mainly in Wales, where Chumley's family are kind of from, that there are elements of Welsh practices. And in fact, having got some of the books they talk about as some of the source material for Cult of Sabotage ideas, and I can see the elements are there that are drawn from Welsh magical practices. Now, whether it's family tradition or it's published texts that talk about Welsh magical practices, I wouldn't know. And you can't. It's like Andrew Chumley died a good few years back now. He was actually quite young. He's only a year older than I am, which is distressing. He passed away a good few years. He died of a massive asthma attack, unfortunately. Although some will tell you that they killed him off magically, which is complete nonsense, but he did unfortunately pass away quite young. But his writings, he's taking things in a different direction, which is, I find fascinating. We like his stuff, let me put it that way. I'm quite impressed by it. So, but there are other practices that there's a blurring now that is occurring between different forms of magical craft that are mixing different elements that are a lot of what we call personal gnosis, which is kind of your own constructed system. Again, based on historic elements, and some are entirely brand new and put together. It's not a problem, because ultimately the idea is if it works, it works. That's what matters. Yeah. Whether it's ancient from sort of the non-existent Druids of the past, or it's sort of ancient Greek material from prehistory, or it's something that someone put together 20 years ago. If it works, it works. I mean, a good example we've talked about ourselves before is one of my interests is the Icelandic Stave magic. Icelandic Stave magic is unique to Iceland. It occurs nowhere else. It's a combination of kind of runic magic and ceremonial magic. Some of the sigils of Goetic magic particularly have been combined together to create these staves, these magical symbols. You don't get anything like that historically anywhere else other than Iceland. And yet, you see versions of it in modern times now coming out from various different writers who create their own versions, which, again, why would that be a problem? Because these things have clearly been put together by somebody or a group of people at one particular point in time. When Christianity first reached the shores of Iceland, these other texts came with them because it was relatively recent. Obviously, relatively recent, about the 1500s, so it was a long while ago, but when Christianity really came to places like Iceland. So they came sort of hand in hand, the sort of magical practices of Central Europe with the Goetic magic and Solomon, and Christianity itself came almost together. So you get this unique blending of two different systems that work together happily, comfortably. So, you don't have to, you can be a purist of one particular form of magic if you want to be, but you don't have to be. I mean, I've written, several books, and they're all about different elements of the occult. They're quite different elements of the occult. They're somewhere apart, and particularly people who've read my rune book get annoyed I've written about stuff that other than runes. I think, how dare you write about more than just runes? It's like, what? People talk that way. They do. Some of the people who've picked up my book on the runes are somewhat right-wing leaning, shall we say, capitalist of that element, unfortunately, that exists in certain parts. The fact that my next book out next year is on the dark side of the Kabbalah, Jewish magic, is going to horrify them, but I don't give a damn. It's what I write about, what I'm interested in. So, that it is okay to blend, as long as you kind of know what you're doing. It's important to have a good foundation knowledge in what it is you're working with before you start trying and blend things together or, cut corners, if you like. You have to do the work. You can't just say, oh, right, I'm not going to do this bit, I'm going to just do that bit and see what happens. Because what tends to happen is nothing happens. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't work. But you can blend and intermix stuff if you do it the right way. It's like making a good cup of tea. If you like milk and sugar in your tea, you've got to get the right amount of milk and the right amount of sugar to make a nice cup of tea. If you like 2 sugars, you put in 6, or half a cup's milk, or your tea bakes for 30 seconds or 2 hours, it's going to be horrible. You've got to get the balance right. If you can get the balance right, you can make something that's really nice.
It's funny you should talk about the Icelandic stave magic, because me and Paul know that Kerry's quite fascinated with that particular sort of magic, aren't you, Kerry?
No, only one particular piece of it.
Would you like to?
It's the necromapants. I find that absolutely fascinating that somebody would do it. Oh, God. Goodness me, where do you start with stuff like that?
Necropants.
I mean, it's necropants, yeah. I mean, Andy, tell everybody about necropants. Because they are amazing.
Again, specifically unique to Iceland. They're designed as protection, and they are the lower half of a man, waist down, skin stripped off, including the naughty bits, left in place. And you're supposed to wear them. You're supposed to put a silver coin in the scrotum, and they protect you. There's a sigil, which is a stave that's written inside them, and they protect you magically. Oh. That is the necropants.
But you do have to have permission from the person who you're taking the bottom half from. It's not just like... Yeah, you have to have permission. I mean, God, who would grant that kind of permission is the question, but hey-ho. I just find that side of it absolutely fascinating. It's like, where did that come from?
That very much is unique. I mean, the idea of using flesh and body parts is a common practice, but those necropants are quite specific. I mean, it's one of those things, you see quite often in witchcraft, is the use of the human skull. It's like this sort of container of power, if you like. It's a container of the seat of a person. It's a common thing you see, whether they're real or sometimes very good resin fakes, but it's common to see a human skull as part of witchcraft practices. But again, you see paintings of those kind of things, but not a lot of actual evidence of it. I mean, there are examples. I mean, I know Cunning Man had a human skull, but it's not universal. What excrements were used by these people is not that well known. So you find the use of human body parts. I mean, there's sort of books bound in human skin, especially particularly potently and powerful. I don't know why, but maybe it's because it's a human being that's the link, that kind of power uses.
Yeah.
I know of someone who recently did acquire a human skull, and we're quite sure that the former occupant of the skull wasn't very happy because she kept popping up in his house. It became haunted for a while the skull was there. Once you got rid of the skull, the whole thing stopped. But there's very definitely, I think it was we don't know, but we think it was probably the owner of the skull wasn't very happy. So that can definitely happen. I think it's an unusual thing, the idea of perhaps using human body parts, but it's actually quite a common practice. I mean, there's the Society of the Bonesmen, which I know a little bit about as well, and they make bone flutes, which are made from human femur, or other sort of long bone that can be hollowed out and used as a flute. Very common practice in Tibetan mysticism, the Kangnang, which is again a bone flute, which again has great potency and magical power. That connection, it depends, what society it is. Certainly with the Tibetan stuff, there's the Chode faith, which is an old faith that's kind of interwoven into Tibetan Buddhism, but it's about doing things that other people find scary. The idea is the Chode, you have ritual chanting and prayer in a graveyard because you're working with the luminal area, the kind of the merging of life and death, but also to do something in a scary place is actually part of it. The idea of going to do your chanting in the graveyard because it's scary. You're supposed to actually do that for that reason. So, the use of human body parts is a common practice throughout the world in terms of magical practices.
Paul?
Okay, so I've got an interest in the Icelandic runes.
Mm-hmm.
And you suggested a book, didn't you, for the Icelandic magic?
Yes.
Do I need to get myself a pair of Necro pants?
If you'd like to, yeah. You could if you wanted to.
Who are you going to ask?
I have no idea.
Richard, would you prefer to donate?
No, I'm fine, thank you very much.
There's a whole practical side of this that my mind has just gone down a road of, and it's just wrong on so many levels. So, okay, so let's talk then about magical tools. It sounds to me like, again, your individual practitioner would have individual tools, and then some of those tools have then become like the common threads through, like the cauldron, the knife, you get certain things that come through. But individual practitioners would have devised, that's not the right word, devised their own magical tools?
Very possibly. I mean, you get a crossover point with the grimoire stuff again when you talk about magical tools, because the stuff that Gardner outlines in his Wicca, they're borrowed from grimoire magic. They are actually borrowed from the Book of Solomon, because they talk about there the knife, the bowlskin, the curved blade. There's no cauldron in there, but other elements and objects that play a part in his Wicca are found in the Book of Solomon. They've been borrowed from there. So there are a series of tools, depending on, again, which form of witchcraft you're working with. But again, this is the modern stuff. There's nothing in the folklore stuff about any particular item that a witch would have had. I mean, they talk about herbs you would collect that would have magical properties, as in, I don't know about cold pepper. But there's no list of knives or tools. Sometimes it's an interesting thing, actually. One tool in particular that's become quite popular as being very important and a historic item. It's called the stang, which is a two-pronged fork, which is used by farmers, or a two-pronged branch that looks like a stang. It's often talked about in traditional witchcraft as being an important item. Prior to Robert Cochrane's writing in the 1960s, there's no evidence of it whatsoever. And yet many people will tell you, the stang is important. It's like the bolster and the knife. They're all important tools. No, he made that one up. He actually said himself he made it up later in his life before he committed suicide. That it's now seen as being of traditional witchcraft that goes back centuries. There's no evidence whatsoever, but yet it's become seen as an essential tool for that particular pathway. So it's interesting how, again, invented history.
This seems very interesting. It's very interesting, isn't it, to see where these threads come through.
Yeah.
I mean, nowadays, the modern witch will have an altar and she'll have the four items on there that relate to the 4 elements and all that sort of thing. But there's no definitive guide to that way back in history that these things tie in.
Yeah, no, I mean, you can think that Gardner talks about his altar. Often the ceremonial stuff, as I said, borrowed is really Alexander Sanders, who came a little bit later than Gardner. He's the one that's responsible for bringing a lot of those sort of ritual elements into it. But there are these items that have particular relevance. I mean, but again, they kind of... it's wrong to say made up, because it always sounds a bit kind of frivolous. They are reinterpretations. So we said there are... ideas have been borrowed from other places that don't really necessarily belong in historic witchcraft, because there's no evidence for it.
Paul?
Yeah, so, I mean, there's the stereotypical witch, the whole black hat, the black clothing, the green face or whatever. Where does that idea of a witch come from?
Hollywood.
Is it just from the movies?
Pretty much the films, movies have originated of that kind of imagery. I mean, early on, obviously, they borrowed things like from folklore, things like the Grimm's fairy tales, the kind of depictions sort of in there, but that image that we have in mind now of the witch with the hat and all that kind of stuff, again, little bits of evidence of like paintings and art from history, but predominantly it's Hollywoodization that's created that imagery, yeah.
You see a lot of 17th century woodcut sort of print blocks that's probably where it started from. It's probably sort of like an exaggerated sort of form of 17th century clothing, especially the hat. They did wear quite wide-brimmed hats, whether conicaled or not is another. Yeah.
Again, partly from the Grimm's fairy tales as they played a big part in that. As you say, Richard, paintings and woodcuts, but often the average sort of quotation marks witch would be no distinguishable than any other person. Because of course, why would you? You wouldn't, if you're potentially put your head up too high the church and chop it off. You're not going to draw too much attention to yourself, are you?
Mm. So where would the tradition of witches flying, the broomstick and stuff like that come from?
It's a debated one. It is a hotly debated one. There is a suggestion that there was what called the witch's ointment, which was applied to the broomstick, which they would sit on and then believe they were flying, because the body would connect with it and it would be absorbed in a rather sensitive part of the body.
It's a very polite way of putting it, Andy, I have to say.
You know where I'm going with this, don't you?
Oh, hell yeah.
We know exactly where that cream's going.
Yeah, we kind of just wanted to hear you see how you would put it.
Yeah, that's the most likely source of the idea of the witch flying. She was kind of off her head, basically, having absorbed the elixir into the body. So rather than actually literally flying, because there were no real reports of it. It's a story that you see, and again, woodcuts are claimed. It's like the hearsay thing. It's like, this is the proof that she's a witch because she was seen flying on a broomstick. No one saw her, but it was that's why they've accused her of being a witch.
I've often seen woodcuts, sort of like, particularly from the 17th century, there's a lot of sort of floating down rivers on planks. Seems to be quite prominent. I don't know quite where that comes from, but that sort of seems to have been lost. But I think the flying on broomsticks has taken over. That's probably yeah.
I don't think, though, we should take out, like, we talk about the Hollywoodization of certain ideas, but I also think when you start looking at ancient texts, I say ancient texts, old texts, you can't take out a person's sensationalization at the time either. I mean, you've only got to look at the Malleus Maleficarum, where he details about witches cutting off men's members and keeping them in nests. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Clearly that didn't happen. So that's a sensationalization of something.
Maybe they were just special patches for the necropants.
Maybe they were.
It's repaired.
You'd have to go and pick one out. And when you start looking at that, you can't take out the human factor in this, of the sensationalization of things to fit your narrative of how you want people to perceive stuff. Yeah. And this is, we have this across history, what's the famous saying that the winner writes history, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yes, you are dealing with, again, about sort of political power here, about the way of condemning certain elements of the population that might be getting in your way and annoying you. You know, it's like, what more feverish nonsense can we come up with about witches that, oh, yes, they can do this, they can do that, you know, because we have to root them out, because we are the church, we have to be supreme power, and, you know, we have to prove that we are the righteous ones, that we are the ones that are working in God's name, and that other lot over in Italy aren't. You know, it comes down to that. It really does. But it gets lost. We forget the back. Often this is the thing, we forget the background and history to these things. We see it in isolation without looking at the broader picture of the history that's around it.
But that's a human failing, isn't it? A flaw of the human condition, isn't it? We just don't look at the bigger picture. We only look at the bit we want to look at. And today it's playing out time and time again. In, you know, you can see that particular facet of the human nature playing out widely across the internet, which, you know, we've got now. As back in the day, all they had were the broadsheets, you know, like the very early printing that came through and the hand-scribed books, and it purely is basically what the person wanted to put in it, without it necessarily having to be true. But as long as it fitted the narrative they wanted to put over.
Absolutely, that you know, that is a very good point. It is what suits to be included in the story, and what story you want to put up. You know, what are you trying to achieve by the story you're telling? There's a background to it. What is that? Yeah.
And this is a main problem we have when we're trying to find out the history of, you know, witchcraft, as it says. And then you get really murky, because you get people making things up. You've talked about Gerald Gardner. Aleister Crowley was another one, wasn't he? He just kind of did his own thing and pushed the boundaries. They're bloody everywhere, that man, didn't he?
We could talk about him, we could talk a whole show about him easily. But yeah, I mean, he's been woven into the Gerald Gardner story. It's highly unlikely to have anything to do whatsoever. But he got woven into the story because it's like, let's see what other famous names we can draw into this story. But I mean, he was a former member of the Golden Dawn. He worked with that kind of ceremonial magic, and that was really his kind of main thing his entire career. You know, wasn't involved in witchcraft at all, but some would have it that he helped write Gerald Gardner's Book of Shadows. The Book of Shadows is the Bible, if you like, of Wicca. It's the book of magic. That he supposedly co-wrote that, which is highly unlikely. I mean, almost like he didn't have any involvement at all. Probably never, may have met the guy, but probably had no real involvement of that, because it's a very different branch of magic. There wouldn't be much of a crossover. So he tends to sort of crop up in the story, but whether he was actually involved, I think it's highly unlikely.
Wow. It's an ever-evolving situation, this is, isn't it? So where do you think the future of witchcraft is going to go? Do you think it will come full circle and go back more to its folk roots, or do you think it will continue being this mishmash of different ideas coming through?
I have no idea. To be honest with you, I couldn't tell you. I think it's finding its own path. The internet has, of course, changed everything. Nothing's sacred or hidden anymore. You know, all these texts were, certainly the things that the grimoires are talking about at the beginning of the books of Solomon, etc., that kind of thing was all very well hidden away. Now it's available everywhere. I mean, how many editions do you want to find? You can find free PDFs of them. So I think to answer your question, I think there's probably, the last few years, a kind of shift towards what I referred to before as the personal gnosis. It's your own way of working. You know, people want to involve themselves in something historic, then fine. Want to invent something for themselves, then fine. Create a blurring of the two, then fine. And that is a lot of modern occult publishing, proper sort of higher level, if you like, rather than the kind of coffee table stuff you might see around sort of the kind of sort of basic witchcrafty stuff. A lot of the higher stuff is these days personal gnosis. It's your own path, where you're creating your own current, as we kind of call it in the occult world. The current is like an underground kind of energy that you're working with yourself. There's a lot of that going on, which, again, some of it's bloody awful, some of it's brilliant. One of the difficulties, I mean, I get moaned at for saying this by people, that in the age of self-publishing, there's a lot of rubbish out there that's really badly written and poorly researched, but it's getting people are buying it, picking it up, because it's so easy to do now on things like Amazon, Create Space and Lulu. It's easy to publish this stuff that's not even been read by anybody else. It's not been proofread or anything or corrected, and it's just made available. But there is also some absolute gems out there, some really, really good stuff, really well written, that's well researched, and quite frankly works. So I think that's, you're probably going to see more different paths appearing and forming, and different reworkings, and renegotiating different levels and pathways, intertwining, and new ways of working being brought in together. I think it's become more widely available for definite, and people feel they are freer now to find their own path, or if they can't find a path for themselves, is to create their own path. I think that would be the best way of putting it.
It becomes more fluid.
Yes.
It's always been fluid from the show, listening to it. It seems it's always had a fluidity, but it's a quicker fluidity now because of the access to information we have.
Yeah. The danger is that people are cobbling together systems that, quite frankly, can potentially be dangerous. You're getting people who've literally only ever picked up one book of magic trying to summon powerful entities after reading about 5 pages, and then, coming to people like myself and asking help. I don't know what I've caused. I mean, I get emails like that. I get messages, people asking me to help them because I had no details, but someone not that long ago contacted me about my book on Enochian magic, and was trying out sort of the middle of the book before even trying all the early stuff, and then saying, this weird stuff's happening in my flat, what have I done? I said, well, you should have started with page 1 for a start.
Go back to page 1.
Yeah, the worrying trend is paranormal teams are starting to bring magical practice into the paranormal in the attempt to get an elevated level of activity. And like you said, it's incredibly dangerous practice. I've seen that twice recently, of people trying to do rituals that summon a demon, and whether or not they're successful or not, well, it's subjective, but it's a worrying trend.
Well, as we've talked before, I am very much of the opinion that when you're trying to do things like that and you don't really know what you're doing, it's like picking up a phone and pressing random buttons hoping to phone your friend up. The chances are you're not going to get anybody. Nothing's going to happen. Most often when magical practice isn't done properly, nothing happens. You get this idea of you go wrong or the devil gets through and that sort of thing. It doesn't really happen that way. But, yeah, I mean, I've written an article for a period that was published a little while ago about the Dybbuk and Dybbuk boxes. It's this bizarre blending of a very genuine medieval and earlier spirit possession called the Dybbuk, which is specific to Judaism. And sometimes it's not even evil. It's not a negative. Sometimes it's a positive thing. Someone trying to fulfill a mission, if you like, that they didn't do in their own life, so they temporarily possess someone in order to complete the task. And they've gone from that into this bizarre notion of a box being possessed by Dybbuk. By the very nature of Dybbuk, he doesn't possess a box. He can't do. It's the whole bloody point. But yet it's become all these people buying these Dybbuk boxes and opening up, these bad things are happening. Yeah, because the chances are you're invocating yourself. You're literally giving your energy into this thing, and then something weird happens because of what you're doing. There's no more Dybbuk than is Daffy Duck, but you force something to happen. That's the thing, if you're using complex, high-level ceremonial magic, you don't do it right, bugger all happens. If you're trying to work low-level stuff and you're putting your energy and your vibe into it, you're giving energy into the thing itself, so it can manifest something by the nature of what you are doing. That's the thing to be careful of.
I actually saw somebody asking for somebody who was selling Dybbuk boxes, like who out there sells Dybbuk, and I was so tempted. So tempted to say, yeah, I can do you a Dybbuk box.
Wax it or candle out.
I can do an eco-friendly Dybbuk box. Just a little cardboard box.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, I might do that. I'll list them on eBay. Eco-friendly Dybbuk boxes.
Well, the funny thing is, the original Dybbuk box, which appeared in, I think it was in a movie, but I think it was just more like a creepypasta story in the early 2000s. That we've all seen a picture of the guy opens up, and it's a wine crate, and there's no wax covering it. So where this idea of covering wax came from even is a bit of a mystery, because that's an invention as well.
I think that stems from the witch.
Sort of sealing the box or something like that.
Blimey. Yeah, it's just modern.
Again, that modern evolution of something that they've seen that was old. That they thought,
Yeah. I mean, it's a funny thing when you talk about that kind of thing, adaptation. We all know there never was any such thing as a voodoo doll. It was an invention by Christianity when it first went to the Caribbean to try and prove that the Caribbean people were not worshipping God. They said that they made these things called voodoo dolls to harm people. There's no such thing. There never was such thing. It is actually a puppet, which you've talked about before, which comes to witchcraft again. This idea of malicious witchcraft, where you try to cause harm to a person by putting pins in this representation of them, which is a puppet. Now, if you go to voodoo practitioners in places like Haiti and even in New Orleans, you can get genuine voodoo dolls now, because they've taken the idea on board and added it to voodoo practice, because it's very much a living practice, voodoo. It's involving it. It's not set in stone as one particular form of work. But yeah, you can now get genuine voodoo dolls because they've adopted the idea into their practices. It wasn't there before, but it is now. So yeah.
It's supply and demand, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's what people wanted, so they started making them.
Fascinating. I find the whole thing fascinating. Yeah. How, this is one area where you can sort of see threads of evolution, but without a full-blown, like I said earlier, this hodgepodge of history that's and tantalizing touches from history, like, the mummified cats and the witches' bottles and, things like that, the poppets and sigils that they used to put on, that bedpost for King James I, things like that. When you start looking at things like that, and those things get taken without really understanding it and adopted into something. And it's just fascinating to me. We have actually come to the end of the show, guys.
Good Lord.
Really? Wow, that was quick.
It just goes fascinatingly quick, doesn't it, when we get onto topics like this?
It does. Shall we do an extension?
Well, maybe on another show.
Okay.
Maybe we shall expand on this on another show. And I'd like to thank Mr. Mercer. Thank you so much for joining us and bringing some, showing us that there isn't much sense to the historical references of witchcraft, really. That it is sort of a made-up history. Everyone picks their bit and decided to go with it.
Reconstructed. Let's stick with reconstructed history. Made-up sounds
reconstructive. Yeah, we'll go with that. Andy, where can people find copies of your book? Particularly, you've written How the Wicked Shall Decay and your runic books and, the Corona Corunzum one and all, not Corona Corunzum.
Libra Corunzum.
Thank you, Liber Corunzum. Goodness me, where can people get copies of your book?
Okay, a quick rundown. At the moment, the only book of mine that's readily available is The Wicked Shall Decay, which you can get from Three Hands Press in America or Midian Books in the UK. My book on the runes, which the first edition sort of went out of print a couple of years back, is about to be republished in the second edition by Troy Books, which you can get from them and various places. It's now called Runa. It's been retitled back to its original title. It was Runan before, it's now Runa with an A because that's what it was called originally. That should be out either the end of this year or early next year. That's the second edition of that. Any day now, Three Hands Press will publish my book on Dante's Inferno, which we talked about a few weeks ago. That's literally due out this month. And Liber Corunzum will be coming out in the second edition itself, probably not at least next year, maybe year after, but certainly a little way off yet because I've just started work on the second edition of that. I've also my book on the dark side of the Kabbalah called the Sefer HaSitra Akra should be out early next year, again from Three Hands Press. Unfortunately, because of certain circumstances we know about a certain pandemic that's affected a lot of people, it slowed down publication, unfortunately, for Three Hands Press, so that's why they're a bit delayed, but they will be out relatively soon.
Fantastic.
Excellent.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us once again, and I'm sure you'll be back. On another fascinating topic at some point in the future.
Absolutely.
On that note, if you'd like to see any of our very minor writings compared to Andy's, pop over to our website, paranormalconcept.com, and check out all the latest blogs that are up there.
Another thing, we've been nominated for the Higgy Pop Awards.
Yes.
the best paranormal podcast. So you can also vote for us if you like the show. You can vote for us on the website as well. It's a big thing.
What's that website's name?
It's paranormalconcept.com.
Okay, there you go.
Well, there's a link there, or you can go direct to the Higgy Pop page and find the awards there, like the nomination awards there. And we'll be very grateful if you could vote for us, because, you know.
Absolutely. Because we are the best.
It would be lovely. Anyway, on that note, say good night, guys.
Good night, guys.
Good night, guys.
At the Halifax, we know that catching up and checking in on each other has never been more important. So when our customers couldn't come into a Halifax branch, we picked up the phone and gave them a call. In fact, this year we've made over 250,000 wellbeing calls to customers for a natter and a catch-up, just to see if they're doing okay. Halifax, it's a people thing.
We are the University of Bedfordshire, where groundbreakers take risks, where future leaders make their mark, where high flyers soar. Get the support and opportunities to achieve more, become more, defy expectations. Find out how a degree at Bedfordshire can change your life. Book now for our open day on November 21st at beds.ac.uk/defy.